She is on her knees, pressing the wrinkles from her sister's wedding gown, and the door she has not been invited through opens, and the Duke is standing in it, looking not at the bride's dress, but at her. The gown is ivory silk, Brussels lace at the hem, cut wide enough that it pools across the stone floor like spilled cream. It was delivered from the dressmaker in Derby 3 days prior, carefully wrapped in muslin and tissue, and somewhere between the cart and the anteroom it had acquired a faint gray smudge along the lower lace. Ink, from someone's careless hand. The kind of mark that would show in candlelight and ruin everything. Nora had discovered it at 6 this morning. She has been on her knees beside it for 40 minutes. The candles in the sconces have been burning since first light. The wax has already begun to run, leaving small pale tracks down the silver holders, which no one but Nora has noticed. The room smells of beeswax polish and hothouse roses that were brought up from the orangery yesterday and arranged in tall white columns along the wall, petals already softening in the January warmth of indoors. Nora is 23 years old. She is wearing gray wool, mended at both elbows. Her hands move in careful circles across the lace, with a cloth dampened in cold water and a small amount of salt, because that is what removes ink from fine fabric without spreading it. And she knows this because she has had to learn the kinds of things that no one with alternatives ever bothers to learn. She does not look up when the door opens. She does not look up because whoever has entered the room is not here for her. They never are. Before I take you back to where this all began, if you have ever felt invisible in a room that was built around you, if you have ever folded yourself small so that someone else could take up more space, stay with me. This story is for you. Subscribe to Whispered Thrones so you never miss a single one of these. And now, let me take you back. Nora Calloway was the elder daughter of the Reverend Thomas Calloway of Whitmore, Derbyshire, a gentle, bookish man who believed in the improving power of education and applied it conscientiously to his elder child without ever pausing to consider that the world she was being educated for did not particularly want educated women. He taught her Latin declensions and household accounting, and the fine points of legal correspondence. And then he died of a lung fever in the autumn of 1812, leaving behind a second wife, a stepdaughter named Cecily, a modest house, and no income. Nora was 20 when her father died. In the legal and social arithmetic of the Calloway household, she was nothing, not Mrs. Calloway's blood, not Cecily's full sister, not a servant with a formal wage. She was the remainder left over after a sum had been done. She was permitted to remain under the roof on one condition, that she earn her keep, and so she had. For 3 years, she had managed the household correspondence, the accounts, the quarterly records, anything requiring literacy, which Cecily possessed only partially, and Mrs. Calloway deployed only when it served her. Nora's quarterly allowance was 4 shillings. Calling it a wage would have been charitable. She had written twice to agencies in London seeking a position as a governess or private secretary. She had not received a reply. What she said she wanted, when she allowed herself to want anything, was to find a decent paid position, to stop being treated as a servant in the house that had once been her father's home, and start being treated as a person with a professional use and a name that appeared on contracts. What she actually wanted was smaller than that, and larger than that at once. She wanted one person, just one, to look at her and understand that she was capable of more than she had been permitted to be, not to rescue her. Not to love her, simply to see her and register, in some clear and unambiguous way, that there was something there worth seeing. She had wanted this since the week after her father's funeral, when the household had reorganized itself so swiftly and so thoroughly around Mrs. Calloway's management that it was as though Nora had never mattered in it at all. Her fear, the fear she kept under the household accounts where no one would look, was that she did not matter in it, that she was not being treated unjustly, that she simply was not enough, and never had been, and that the silence from the London agencies was not oversight but verdict. This fear was what kept her obedient when she should have been furious. It sat in her chest like a cold, small stone, and she had learned to work around it. What Nora had, in the absence of power, was precision. She thought in clean, straight lines. She could see the structure of a situation, who benefited, who paid, where the leverage was, within minutes of walking into a room. She had learned this at 16, when she discovered, reviewing the household accounts, that Mrs. Calloway had been attributing domestic expenses to her father's charitable fund and underpaying tradespeople, on the understanding that the discrepancy would never be noticed. Nora had noticed. She had said nothing. She had filed it away in the small leather notebook she kept tucked inside her wool stocking. Not a diary, but a record. Amounts owed. Agreements made and not honored. Correspondences sent and ignored. It was not evidence for any court. It was evidence for herself. Proof that what had happened, that she had been there, that the account of things she carried in her head was accurate, even when everything around her insisted otherwise. Edmund Carew, Duke of Ashverne, was 31 years old and held the Ashverne dukedom, which encompassed 12,000 acres of Derbyshire, a London townhouse in Mayfair, majority ownership of 2 textile mills in the north, and a seat in the House of Lords that he had occupied with characteristic silence for 4 years. His income was substantial enough that most people never spoke to him about money. They assumed it was beneath him to discuss it. It was not beneath him at all. He simply preferred that financial conversations occur in writing, where the numbers could be checked. He had the look of a man who had trained himself not to react until he had finished thinking. Angular, dark-eyed, with a particular quality of stillness that was not remoteness, exactly, but something closer to patience, made structural. He was not handsome in the way that Cecily would have hoped, or indeed in any way that announced itself immediately. He was the kind of man who became more significant the longer you were in a room with him, because the room always, quietly, arranged itself around him. 2 days before the wedding, in his study at Ashverne Hall, Edmund had been working through a stack of correspondence from the Calloway household, letters pertaining to the match, the arrangements, the practical matters of the ceremony and the household's arrival. His secretary had brought them in, tied in order of date, and Edmund had read them in order, systematically, the way he read everything. Near the middle of the stack he had paused. He had set one letter down, and then picked it up again. He said, "To no one. Who writes like this?" His secretary did not know. Edmund set the letter with the others, and returned to his work, but the question stayed. The letters were beautifully constructed, not prettily written, not decorative, but precise, structured, with an unusual habit of framing legal considerations in the second paragraph of every note, as though anticipating objections before they were raised. He had agreed to this match partly on the strength of those letters. They had given him the impression of a person with a sensible, serious mind. He had looked forward, in his cautious way, to meeting her. It had not occurred to him that the woman who wrote the letters might not be the woman he was to marry, because the letters were never attributed to Cecily specifically. They came from the Calloway household, as was standard. He had assumed. He was, as he would shortly discover, not the only one in this story who had made that error, but he was perhaps the one who had made it most consequentially. The world outside the windows of Ashverne Hall that January was bitter and hard. Napoleon had been gone from Europe less than a year. England was in the uncomfortable economic aftermath of a long war. Prices elevated, mills adjusting to peacetime demand. The gentry performing confidence about their incomes, while privately doing anxious arithmetic. Whitmore Village was a mill town, dependent on Ashverne employment, and the people in it were careful about how they conducted themselves in relation to the estate. The class gap between the Duke and anyone in the Calloway household was not merely financial, it was categorical. Edmund signed documents that determined the fate of the household without knowing Nora existed. Nora had read his name on estate notices a dozen times without ever expecting to be in a room with him. He was consequential by definition. She was invisible by the same logic, and yet she had spent the last 6 months writing him letters. She had not known that was what she was doing. She had written what she was told to write, at Mrs. Calloway's dictation, in her own most careful hand. And then she had made it better, quietly. Between the dictation and the final fair copy, she had added the legal framework. She had anticipated the objections. She had chosen the words. She had signed the letters, as instructed, from the household, which was technically accurate and practically a fiction. And she had folded them and sealed them and handed them to the post. She had written him, word by careful word, into a marriage with her sister. She did not know he had noticed. She did not know he was asking who wrote like this. She was on her knees in an anteroom at 6 in the morning, removing an ink stain from a gown she was not invited to wear, at a wedding where she existed only as domestic staff. And then the door opened. She looked up because the silence extended too long to ignore. Not shyness. She had no particular shyness about strangers, but the practiced non-reaction of someone who had learned that whoever entered a room was almost never there for her. He was tall, dark-coated, with the quality of stillness she had never quite been able to articulate when she later tried to write it down in her notebook. He did not fill the doorway the way men of large ambition fill doorways. He occupied it precisely, as though the doorway were the correct dimension and he had simply understood this. She registered, before she registered anything else, that he was significant, a man whose existence had weight in it. Then she saw the signet ring on his right hand, the Ashverne crest. She had copied that crest onto 3 formal letters in the past year. She knew its lines better than she knew her own face in a glass. She looked back down at the gown. The cost of that moment, the involuntary second before she looked away, was something she could not entirely name. It was the particular cold of being seen at your worst by the person whose good opinion would have mattered. If you had ever been permitted to want it, she was on the floor, in mended wool, with a damp cloth in her hand. He was the Duke of Ashverne, standing in the doorway of his own house, looking at her with an expression she did not allow herself to read. He said, quietly but without warmth, "You are not Miss Cecily Calloway." It was not a question. Nora rose, not hastily, because hasty would look like guilt, and straightened, and smoothed her skirt with one hand. She was steady. She had learned to be steady when she was frightened, the way she had once learned, at 14, to carry full soup tureens across an uneven flagstone floor, slowly, deliberately, with all her attention on the destination. "No, Your Grace. I am her sister." A pause. He looked at her with the particular quality of attention she had not encountered before. Not appraisal, not dismissal. Something more careful than either, he said. "The correspondence came from this house." Another pause. Shorter. "Did you write it?" Nora said nothing. Her silence was its own answer, and she knew it, and so did he. He inclined his head, not a bow, something more considered than that. The acknowledgement of something he had noted and filed, and withdrew. The door closed. Nora exhaled slowly through her nose. She looked down at the gown. The ink stain was gone. She had done the work. She told herself this was enough. She told herself this for approximately 2 hours, until the carriage arrived to take the household to the church, and she was placed, by Mrs. Calloway's quiet instruction, in the very last seat of the very last row, where she sat alone behind the congregation like a footnote to someone else's story. 2 hours before the ceremony, Edmund's solicitor, a dry and careful man of 50 named Tate, had drawn the Duke aside in the estate's east corridor and presented him with a document, the Calloway lease agreement. It was due for renewal in February. Mrs. Calloway had been in arrears for 8 months, Tate explained, with the professional neutrality of a man who had delivered unwelcome information many times before, that Mrs. Calloway had been made aware of this situation since October, and that her motivation in pressing for the match was, in no small part, the belief that a familial connection to the Ashverne estate would resolve the debt quietly. Edmund read the document. Then he read it again. He understood immediately. He had not been chosen. He had been leveraged. The match that had been presented to him through a shared solicitor was not a social negotiation. It was a financial exit. He was not being invited into a relationship. He was being presented with someone else's bad debt, dressed in ivory silk. He folded the document. He said to Tate, "The wedding proceeds as arranged. Bring me the original correspondence from this household, every letter, in order." Tate was confused. Edmund was not interested in explaining himself. He walked to the church because there was something he needed to understand before he decided anything, and the church was where the time was. The ceremony began in St. Michael's, Whitmore, with the low winter light coming through the old stone windows in thin, cold columns, and candles burning at the altar in the draught. Edmund stood at the front, composed, watching the door. Cecily came in on Mrs. Calloway's arm, pretty, fair, slightly pink from the cold. Her expression the controlled excitement of a woman who had wanted this and was now uncertain whether she still did. The congregation filled the pews with the particular rustling of people who are about to witness something significant and are already deciding how they will describe it at dinner. Nora, in the back pew, watched Edmund turn to look at his bride-to-be and felt, with the cold precision that was both her gift and her grief, that something was wrong. He was present. He was composed. He was also not looking at Cecily the way a man looks at someone he has been corresponding with for 6 months and is finally meeting. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a document he has not yet fully understood. At the midpoint of the ceremony, the officiant well into the address, the vows nearly reached. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched something you built collapse from the back row? Have you ever sat very still, with your hands in your lap, knowing that the disaster unfolding at the front of the room has your fingerprints on it, and knowing that you will be the last one in this church to be asked what happened? That is where Nora is, right now. Keep watching. The officiant reached the customary question, whether any present knew of any lawful impediment, and Edmund raised his hand. The church went silent, not the held-breath silence of surprise, but the colder silence of a room that has understood, all at once, that something it expected to be simple has turned out not to be. Edmund spoke with the quiet, carrying quality of a man who knew how sound moved in a stone. He said he had reason to believe the legal documentation supporting this match contained a material misrepresentation, that he required a brief adjournment before the ceremony could proceed in good conscience, that it was a matter for solicitors, that he asked the officiant to stand down temporarily. He named no one. He looked at no one in particular. His voice had the steady, almost sorrowful precision of a man who is doing something he has decided to do and will not be deflected from. Cecily turned a color Nora had no name for. Mrs. Calloway was on her feet before Edmund had finished his last sentence. The congregation erupted in the specific kind of noise a church makes when propriety has been shattered and no one has yet agreed on what to do about it. Nora, in the back pew, felt the room turn cold around her. She sat very still. She put both hands flat on her thighs and breathed slowly, the way she had taught herself to breathe when the thing happening was too large to respond to immediately. She looked at the altar. She looked at Edmund, who was speaking quietly now to the officiant. She looked at the candles, which were guttering in the draught from the opened vestry door. He had read the letters. She knew it the way she knew when household accounts had been falsified, not from any single piece of evidence, but from the structure of the thing, the shape of his knowledge, the particular quality of that question in the anteroom. Did you write it? He had already known the answer before he asked. The match was never between Edmund and Cecily. It had been, in the strangest possible sense, between Edmund and Nora. She who had anticipated every objection, framed every legal consideration, chosen every word. She had written him into a marriage with someone else, and he had agreed to that marriage on the strength of a voice that was not his bride's. She did not feel the irony. She felt instead the arithmetic. The wedding had collapsed. Mrs. Calloway's debt to the estate was still outstanding. The leverage was still the same. And now, in the social grammar of this small Derbyshire church, the story that would emerge from this afternoon would need someone to blame. She was very clearly, very obviously, going to be that person. 3 escalations arrived within the hour, in the drawing room of Ashverne Hall, where the wedding breakfast had been laid and not eaten. The first was public. The congregation did not leave quietly. By the time the party returned to the hall, the story was already running through the rooms in whisper form, that the Duke had found the bride wanting, that there had been a misrepresentation, that something in the correspondence was not as it appeared. Every eye in the room found Cecily first, then found Nora, who was standing near the window with a plate she had not touched, not weeping, not speaking, simply observing. In the social grammar of 1816, a woman who does not weep at her sister's humiliation is either cold-hearted or complicit. Several guests reached their conclusions before Nora had noticed them looking. The second escalation came from Mrs. Calloway. In the corridor outside the drawing room, in a voice so low it was almost gentle, she knew, she said, that Nora had written those letters. She did not know how the Duke had found out, but she was certain Nora had played some role in the ruination of this day. She was therefore no longer welcome in the household. Her allowance was forfeit. If she was found on the premises after tomorrow morning, Mrs. Calloway would tell anyone who asked that the entire scheme had been Nora's, that she had attempted to deceive the Duke into marrying her instead of Cecily, that it was ambition, that it was deceit, that it was the calculated act of an ungrateful dependent who had bitten the hand that fed her. It was a lie of elegant construction, and Nora had nothing. No position, no references, no home, 4 shillings, with which to contest it. She went back to the drawing room. She put the untouched plate down. She stood by the window and looked at the Derbyshire winter through the glass post, and tried, very carefully, to think. The third escalation came in the form of a footman with a quiet word. His Grace wished to speak with her. She went because she could not afford to refuse. Edmund was in his study, standing at the window, with the letters spread across the desk behind him. And he turned when she came in and looked at her with the same quality of attention she had felt in the anteroom. Careful, direct, not unkind, but not gentle, he said. You wrote the correspondence. I should like to know why. Nora had been made homeless in the last 20 minutes, and was now being asked to account for herself by the man whose actions had caused it. And she understood, with absolute clarity, that he did not know this. He was not being cruel. He was simply a man who operated from information, and he did not yet have all of it. And the gap between his understanding of his own position and the reality of hers was not something she could cross in a sentence, she said, after a moment. Because I was asked to, Your Grace. He said. That is not an answer, she said. It is the only truthful one I have. He studied her. She held his gaze because she had learned, long ago, that looking away when a man studied you was the same as confirming whatever he had already decided. He said finally, I will have Tate provide you with temporary lodgings on the estate while this matter is investigated. He did not ask if she wanted this. He did not explain what was being investigated. He said it the way he had stopped the wedding, with the settled certainty of a man making a decision for someone who was present in the room but had not been consulted. He had, with the best of intentions, made her his ward without her consent, and she was now beholden to the very institution that had, moments ago, destroyed the only home she had. She thanked him. She left. The cottage was small and clean and warm. There was firewood and a daily delivery from the estate kitchen. She was not a prisoner. She was also not free. She began, as was her nature, to document everything. 4 days after the failed wedding, Nora was installed in the cottage, and Edmund was in the Ashverne Hall archive pulling files. He had gone back because of what Tate said, the arrears, the lease, the original agreement. He was not a man who left a financial discrepancy unexamined, regardless of how small it appeared. He had once caught a 6-year embezzlement through a 2-shilling error in a quarterly ledger, and the lesson had lodged permanently. Every number told a story, and the story always led somewhere. He pulled the original tenancy documents from 1801. He read them. He set them down. He read them again. The lease for the Calloway property had been signed by the Reverend Thomas Calloway, and co-signed by a guarantor. Edmund's own father, the previous Duke of Ashverne, the previous Duke had waived the lease fee and designated the property as a charitable residence for the Reverend Calloway in perpetuity. The phrasing that followed, careful, oblique, written in the legal language of a man who wished to record a debt without advertising it, made clear that this was in recognition of some past service. The nature of the service was not named. The current estate solicitor had inherited the file in 1810, following the previous Duke's death. Following standard practice, he had converted the charitable designation back to a standard lease, begun charging rent, and allowed the arrears to accumulate when Mrs. Calloway found she could not pay. He had never checked whether the original waiver should have been honored. It was a bureaucratic failure, quiet and thorough and invisible, until the moment it became catastrophic. There was no conspiracy. There was no malice. There was only the ordinary, devastating competence of an institution that had processed a family's home as an accounting entry and lost the human circumstance inside the gold paperwork. The Calloway family had never been legally obligated to pay a shilling of rent. Nora's father's house had been given to her family as an act of the previous Duke's generosity. The estate had spent 3 years collecting money it was never owed, and the threat of eviction that had driven Mrs. Calloway to engineer an entire marriage had been built on a legal error perpetrated by Edmund's own inheritance. He sat for a long time at his desk after he understood this. He sat with it the way he sat with all information that required reconsidering a position he had already taken, without rushing, without allowing himself the comfort of finding someone else to blame, without looking away from the arithmetic of it. He was not the clean-handed party he had believed himself to be. He had arrived at this story as a man who had been manipulated. He was now discovering that the manipulation was downstream of an injustice his own. He came to his study with the particular stillness of someone who has prepared herself to receive a verdict and has decided in advance not to let it show. He told her what he had found. He did not perform remorse. He stated the facts, plainly, in order, the original designation. The bureaucratic conversion, the arrears, the error. Then he said, the estate owes your family a restitution of 8 months of rent, plus interest, and the reinstatement of the charitable designation as originally specified. He paused. I am sorry. It was the plainest apology Nora had ever heard. It contained no decorative emotion, no extended preamble, no self-exculpation. It was 4 words preceded by a statement of facts, and she was not sure whether it was enough, and she was not sure it was nothing. She sat with it the way he had sat with his own revelation, without rushing, without looking away. She thanked him. She said she would review the documents when they were ready for her signature. She went back to the cottage. She sat by the fire for a long time. She did not write in her notebook. She looked at the firewood and the single window and the small table where her dinner had been delivered in a cloth-covered dish, and she thought about what it meant that the man who had inadvertently caused the destruction of her home had now offered to restore it, and that the restoration, however genuine, returned her to a house where she slept in a room she did not choose and ate on a schedule she did not set and existed, still, in the condition of someone whose life was determined by the decisions of others. The documents were ready 6 days after the failed wedding. Now, before we reach what happens next, I want you to understand what Nora is carrying into that room. 3 years of careful silence, 3 years of filing things away, of performing the arithmetic of survival, of writing her intelligence into other people's letters and signing them from the household and receiving 4 shillings for the work. She is about to enter a room with a man who holds more power than she will ever have. And she is going to say the thing she has never been permitted to say. And she is going to say it not because she expects it to change anything. She is going to say it because someone in this room should say it plainly. Edmund's study at Ashverne Hall, in the evening. The fire was low. Tate had been dismissed. It was only the 2 of them, and the documents spread across the desk, and the particular quality of winter silence that falls in old stone houses when the rest of the household has gone to bed. Nora read the documents. They were correct. Every figure was accurate. The charitable designation was restored. The arrears were canceled. It was, on paper, a full and thorough restitution of everything that had been wrongly taken. She picked up the pen, she held it, she set it down. She looked at him across the desk, at this man who had stopped a wedding with his hand in the air and apologized in 4 words and was now waiting, with the careful patience that was apparently structural in him, for her to do what she had been summoned to do, and something she had been carrying for 3 years, long before Edmund Carew had ever entered her life, came to the surface. You want me to sign this so that you feel as though something has been repaired, she said. Her voice was steady. She was not angry, or she was angry in the way of someone who has kept anger cold for so long that it has become very precise. But I should like you to understand what you are actually offering me. You are offering me the right to return to a house where I sleep in a room I say did not choose, where I am fed on a schedule I did not set, where I write letters for other people and am not permitted to sign my own name to them. You are offering me the right to go back to being nothing in a house that was allegedly given to my family as an act of your father's generosity. And you are asking me to receive this as restitution. She did not raise her voice. I wrote you 100 letters, Your Grace. I answered your legal queries and anticipated your objections and told you, in careful language that I crafted word by word, everything you needed to know about a woman you were prepared to marry, and you were moved by those letters. You have said so, in your indirect way, and I need you to understand, not for any reason that will change my situation, but because someone in this room should say it plainly, that the woman you were moved by was me, not Cecily, me. And you still did not see me until you were forced to. The fire shifted in the grate. Edmund did not move. He was looking at her with the same quality of complete attention he had given to every document he had ever reviewed. Not appraisal, not defense. Not the polite blankness of a man waiting for a woman to finish speaking so that he can answer. He was listening. The distinction was not invisible to her. She picked up the pen. She signed her name. She stood, and the chair made a sound on the stone floor. And she smoothed her skirt once, and she said, "Thank you for the restitution, Your Grace. I will collect my things from the cottage by morning." She moved toward the door. He said her name, not Miss Calloway, not the woman from the correspondence. He said Nora. It was the first time he had used it. It fell into the room with a particular weight. The weight of a word that has been considered before it was spoken. She stopped. She did not turn around. She waited. Her hand not quite on the door, the fire behind her, and the cold corridor ahead. He said quietly, "I have been seeing you since the anteroom." She did not answer. She stood very still for one moment, the length of a breath, the length of a decision, and then she walked out. There are moments when the truth lands in a room and changes the air, and neither person inside it knows yet what it will cost them. This was that moment. The following morning, Tate arrived at the cottage, not with a dismissal, but with a document Nora had not expected. Edmund had directed him to offer her a formal paid appointment as the estate's correspondence secretary, not a domestic role, not a companion's position, a named professional appointment, with a quarterly salary of £40, a suite of rooms in the hall's east wing, and a written contract that specified her responsibilities, her rights, and her name, her full name, in Edmund's handwriting. On the line provided for the appointing party, Tate also delivered a sealed note. Nora read it after he withdrew. It said, "The letters were the best correspondence this estate has received in 11 years. I do not offer you this position because I am sorry. I offer it because you are exceptional at the work, and because I am aware that I benefit more from this arrangement than you do, and the contract should reflect that. If you choose not to accept, the restitution stands regardless, and the cottage is yours for as long as you can require it. Either way, you are not owed anything further, but I am asking." She read it twice. She set it down. She read it a third time, not because she had not understood it, but because she had understood it completely and wanted to be certain she was not wrong. He had made himself formally, professionally, publicly dependent on her answer. The Duke of Ashverne was petitioning the vicar's daughter for her professional services. The paperwork existed. Tate had witnessed it. It could not be undone quietly. She signed her name. For the first time in her life, she signed her name to something that belonged to her. 3 months later, the spring light was doing what it always did to the Ashverne grounds, making everything seem briefly possible, turning the bare trees to copper and the fields to a pale temporary gold. The mills were hiring again. The correspondence moving through the estate's new secretary had impressed even Tate, who did not impress easily. Nora had written, under her own name, to the London agency that had twice ignored her letters. She did not require a position at this time. She had rooms in the East Wing. She had a desk in a small office off the administrative corridor. She had a dark blue dress, which she had purchased herself, which she had worn to dinner at the hall's main table twice now, in the company of estate business guests, where she had been introduced by her title, correspondence secretary. One afternoon, Edmund came to her office and stood in the doorway, as he had stood in the anteroom on a January morning when none of this was imaginable, and he said, "I should like to correspond with you, as myself, if you are willing." Nora set down her pen. She was quiet for one moment. Then she said, "I am already writing to you as myself, Your Grace. I have been since January." He almost smiled. It was the most significant thing that had ever happened to his face. "And if you have stayed with this story until now, if you have sat in the back pew with Nora and watched the room arrange itself around everyone except her, and understood what it costs to fold yourself small for years, and then finally, quietly, say I was here all along, then you know what this is about. Not a wedding, not a rescue. A woman who spent years making herself useful to people who refused to make her real, and what happened when she stopped signing someone else's name. Subscribe to Whispered Thrones. There are more women like Nora waiting to be heard, and I do not intend to let them wait any longer. And if you choose not to subscribe, well, you'll owe me a letter, addressed in your own hand, with your own name, because that is the whole point." She pressed the wrinkles from someone else's gown, and then she signed her name to something that was finally hers.